For all that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service. My father's first words on entering Westminster Abbey yesterday were a pledge of service.
Britain expected a routine palace update, one of those carefully measured royal communications that says very little, changes even less, and disappears into the day by nightfall. Instead, behind a sealed palace door, Prince William delivered a bombshell announcement about Camilla's future that sent a chill through the household, stunned senior courtiers into silence, and forced the monarchy to confront a question it had postponed for far too long. It was not shouted, it was not theatrical. There was no golden lectern, no cheering crowd, no ceremonial flourish. And yet what William said carried the force of a royal rupture, because it did not merely concern Camilla's schedule, her visibility, or her place beside the king. It touched something far more dangerous. It touched her future standing in the next chapter of the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. What made this so explosive was not only the announcement itself, but the timing, the tone, and the unmistakable message behind it. William had chosen a moment of institutional sensitivity, when every movement inside the palace was already being watched for signs of transition, weakness, continuity, or fracture. And instead of offering comfort, instead of offering vague words about unity, he offered clarity. Cold, controlled, royal clarity. The kind that sounds respectful on paper and devastating in private. For Camilla, it meant that the future she may have quietly assumed would remain stable had suddenly become conditional. For Charles, it meant the collision he had most hoped to avoid was no longer theoretical. And for Britain, it meant that the monarchy was no longer simply managing appearances. It was beginning to define its next era. Those who were in the broader orbit of the palace that morning would later say the atmosphere had changed before William even entered the room. There are moments in royal life when everyone feels history moving before anyone dares name it. The corridors become quieter, footsteps slow, secretaries stop making harmless conversation. The ordinary sounds of palace routine begin to feel staged, almost fragile, as if the building itself knows something is about to be altered. William arrived with Catherine at his side for part of the morning, but when the decisive meeting began, he stepped forward alone. That mattered because it told everyone present that what was about to happen did not belong to domestic discussion. It belonged to duty. His words, by all accounts, were measured. That was the part many found most unsettling. He did not accuse, he did not dramatize, he did not reopen old family wounds in language anyone could quote back to him later. Instead, he framed his announcement as a matter of future structure, ceremonial coherence, and long-term institutional stability. Ceremonial coherence meant more than the order of appearances or the location of chairs in a drawing room. It meant the visible logic of monarchy itself, who represents continuity, who embodies the future, who holds influence by right, and who holds it only by the grace of a current arrangement. William, it seemed, had decided that this question could no longer remain blurred. The announcement, as reconstructed later by those who understood its significance, was simple in wording and brutal in consequence. Prince William had informed the palace that any future transition planning connected to his reign would involve a clearly reduced and strictly defined role for Camilla in ceremonial, operational, and symbolic terms. Not erased, not humiliated, not publicly stripped, but reduced, restricted, contained. This was not a temporary scheduling decision. It was a future-facing royal boundary. A boundary around visibility, around influence, around the assumptions the palace had quietly allowed to grow around Camilla's place in the institution. Camilla learned the substance of it not in public, but in private, which somehow made it worse. The country would later feel the shock. The commentators would later fill the air with theories, but the real wound landed first in silence. She was in one of the palace's smaller sitting rooms, where the light in late afternoon softens the furniture and makes old portraits look almost forgiving. One trusted aide remained nearby, then withdrew. Another waited outside. Camilla read the relevant summary, then read it again. Her face, according to someone who saw her only for a moment, did not collapse into obvious distress. It hardened into something more royal and, in its own way, more tragic, composure. The discipline of a woman who had spent years surviving public judgment, only to discover that private judgment could wound more deeply. The truth was more painful, because William's announcement was not merely about the next reign. It was about what the current reign had been quietly allowed to become. Over time, Camilla's place beside Charles had broadened beyond what many outside the palace fully understood. She was not simply visible, she was embedded. Her office had weight. Her instincts were heard. Her preferences carried consequence, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. And informal power inside a monarchy can be more powerful than formal power, precisely because it is harder to challenge without seeming personal. That was the dilemma William had been watching for years. The institution could survive controversy. It could survive criticism. The monarchy could survive many things, but not uncertainty about where authority truly sat when the future and the present began to overlap. Charles, when briefed in full, did not immediately respond. That silence alone said everything. Those who knew him best understood that silence was not indifference. It was conflict, the deepest kind. He loved Camilla, and everyone around him knew it. Whatever history had come before, whatever public storms had raged in earlier decades, the settled truth of his later life was that she had become his source of ease, protection, and steadiness. Yet he also understood the logic of monarchy in a way only a lifetime spent waiting for the throne could teach. He knew that an heir cannot inherit ambiguity. He knew that if William had finally spoken this plainly, then something had crossed a line long invisible to the public but unmistakable to those who lived within palace walls. But to understand why William made such a bombshell announcement, the story did not begin in that room, and it did not begin that week. The decision was not born in a sudden flash of emotion. It was built slowly, layer by layer, through a series of incidents that by themselves looked manageable, almost minor, but together formed a pattern too serious to ignore. The story did not begin with a document or a direct confrontation. It began with tension disguised as etiquette. One of the earliest warning signs emerged during planning for a major national ceremony, an event designed to project continuity, stability, and carefully choreographed unity across the senior generations of the royal family. Such ceremonies are never casual. Every placement, every entrance, every visual line has meaning. Ceremonial precedence is the invisible script that tells the nation who matters, who follows, who leads, and what the institution believes about itself. William's office had advanced a proposal that placed strong emphasis on the line of succession, not as a challenge to Charles, but as reassurance to the country. It was a visual expression of continuity, a quiet answer to uncertainty. Yet when the final drafts came back through the household channels, subtle changes had appeared. Camilla's position had shifted forward. Her speaking prominence had been gently widened. Certain representational duties had been reweighted. None of it looked dramatic in isolation. That was the genius and the danger of it. A change small enough to deny, a change meaningful enough to alter the message. When William saw the revisions, he asked the obvious question: who had authorized this? The answers were vague. Some said it reflected emerging household balance. Others suggested it was a matter of courtesy. One version implied the king's comfort had been a consideration. But the more William asked, the more one truth emerged. There had developed, within parts of the palace, a habit of extending Camilla's role, not because a formal decision had been made, but because no one had stopped the extension while it was still soft enough to reverse. That mattered because unspoken expansion becomes expectation. William did not raise his voice. He had long learned that in royal households, the calmest person often carries the sharpest authority. But those who saw him in the aftermath of that discovery said he was colder than usual, less willing to indulge the palace tradition of letting problems drift until time solves them or buries them. In his view, time was no longer solving this one. Time was enlarging it. Every ceremony, every private adjustment, every assumption that Camilla's present place beside Charles would naturally convert into future standing under William was, in his eyes, planting confusion inside the institution he would one day inherit. Catherine understood before most others how serious this had become. She knew William well enough to recognize the difference between irritation and conclusion. Irritation could fade. Conclusion hardened. She also understood the human danger of the issue. Whatever the constitutional reasoning, whatever the institutional case, any move involving Camilla would be interpreted through decades of family grief, unresolved emotion, and public memory. Yet Catherine also represented, in a very real sense, what William believed must be protected. She was not simply the Princess of Wales. She was the future female center of the monarchy. If that future center entered the next reign under a cloud of inherited ambiguity, then the entire emotional architecture of the crown would begin compromised. The issue sharpened again during a private reception attended by senior palace officials, several trusted advisors, and a small group of representatives linked to royal patronages. It was one of those semi-formal occasions where important things are not announced but are made quietly visible. William noticed that introductions, speaking order, and staff behavior increasingly reflected not merely deference to Camilla's present status, but a kind of anticipatory permanence. A few courtiers were beginning to behave as though her role had already acquired a protected durability beyond the current reign. That was not a legal category. It was worse. It was a cultural habit. And cultural habits inside institutions are harder to uproot than written rules because people stop seeing them as choices. What happened next requires going back to the private exchange that changed everything. The confrontation between father and son took place behind closed doors, with no aides present for the most sensitive part. The room was not grand in the way the public imagines royal rooms to be. That is often how these moments unfold, not under chandeliers, but in spaces designed for practical conversation, where the curtains are heavy, the air feels still, and the history in the walls becomes almost oppressive. Charles began carefully. He spoke, it is said, of loyalty, of proportion, of the years Camilla had endured to stand where she now stood. He reminded William that there were human costs behind institutional language. That mattered because Charles was not arguing only as sovereign. He was arguing as husband. William listened. Then he answered with the argument Charles most feared and perhaps most respected. He said the monarchy could not ask the next reign to inherit undefined emotional arrangements simply because the current reign found them painful to limit. No one raised their voice, but the silence deepened. William was not speaking about dislike. He was speaking about structure, about the difference between what belongs to a reigning king and what can credibly be carried into the reign of his heir, about the danger of allowing the household around Camilla to function, intentionally or not, as if its authority were expandable by custom alone. He had expected concern. He had not expected anger. At one point, according to a later account whispered between senior insiders, Charles asked whether this was truly necessary, or whether it reflected older wounds dressed in constitutional language. It was the sharpest question he could have asked, because it forced William into the most dangerous territory of all. Motive. William did not deny the past. He did not pretend memory played no role. But he insisted memory was not driving the decision. Architecture was. This was not punishment. It was prevention. He believed the next monarchy had to begin with one visible center of female authority beside the king, and that center could not be confused, diluted, or emotionally negotiated in advance. That center, unmistakably, would be Catherine. For Charles, hearing it put so plainly must have felt like an iron door closing somewhere deep in the family. Not because the logic was impossible to grasp, but because it was impossible to escape. If he defended Camilla too directly, he would invite a deeper struggle with his heir. If he yielded too quickly, he would wound the woman who had stood beside him through years of personal and public strain. Kingship, in moments like this, is not grandeur. It is exposure. Exposure to the fact that love and duty are sometimes not companions at all, but rivals that wear each other's language. When Charles later spoke privately with Camilla, the emotional center of the crisis shifted. With William, the discussion had been about principle. With Camilla, it became pain. She asked him, according to one version, not whether William had the right to plan the future, but whether the future now required her diminishment. It was a devastating distinction. Charles may have tried to soften the matter with the language of adaptation, of preserving dignity, of allowing the transition between reigns to remain orderly and calm. But the truth was more painful. Camilla could hear what those words meant. They meant that even if she had done everything asked of her, even if she had given loyalty, composure, and years of service, the next monarchy would still draw a line around her. There are moments when people do not need harsh words to feel rejected. Royal life specializes in that kind of wound. It uses perfect grammar to deliver private heartbreak. It wraps exclusion in phrases like future balance, institutional clarity, and continuity planning. Continuity planning was the term several officials began using in internal conversation after William's announcement. It sounded technical. It was, in reality, emotional triage. Continuity planning meant preparing the monarchy for transition before the transition publicly arrives. It meant deciding who carries forward and who remains attached primarily to the chapter now closing. Once the private confrontation was over, the matter moved from feeling into machinery. And palace machinery, once engaged, has its own cold momentum. Constitutional advisors were consulted. A constitutional advisor is not a courtier and not a family therapist. Such figures exist to assess whether symbolic arrangements threaten institutional clarity, legal consistency, or public understanding of the crown. The Lord Chamberlain's office also became relevant. The Lord Chamberlain is one of the most senior officers of the royal household, responsible for major ceremonial order and internal organization. When offices like these are drawn into a conflict, it means the issue has ceased to be merely personal. It has become structural. Drafts were prepared. Language was tested. Options were assessed for how Camilla's future role might be formally described without creating public humiliation or private rebellion. Should her appearances in key transition-linked events be narrowed? Should the communication channels between her office and the future Wales household be redefined? Should certain ceremonial assumptions be quietly removed from planning documents before they harden into precedent? Precedent is one of monarchy's most powerful forces. A precedent is not always law. It is often stronger. It is the thing done often enough that everyone begins to believe it cannot be undone. William's announcement was, at its core, a refusal to let precedent grow where consent had never truly been granted. Yet this was not only about documents and planning notes. It was also about air, about atmosphere, about the feeling inside the palace that one world was beginning to withdraw from another. Staff sensed it first. They always do. Invitations became more carefully worded. Visibility was discussed with new precision. The phrase future reign sensitivities began to appear in conversations where once there had only been assumptions. Some long-serving officials were unsettled. They had spent years smoothing tensions, not crystallizing them. Others, especially those aligned more closely with William's thinking, believed the palace was finally doing what it should have done long ago. Not insulting Camilla, but delimiting her. The country, meanwhile, knew nothing of the deepest private pain. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Rumors began to spread in the way royal rumors always do, first as atmosphere, then as suggestion, then as near certainty. A shift in how photographs were selected, a subtle change in sequence during a public event, a notable restraint in briefing language about Camilla's long-term royal role. Journalists began calling trusted contacts, senior editors, smelling the possibility of something larger than ordinary household friction, pressed harder. Broadcasters sensed a pattern, but lacked the final confirmation needed to say it plainly. Then came the leak. It did not arrive as a dramatic stack of papers pushed through a newsroom door. It came as converging fragments from different corners of the palace world, all pointing in the same direction. Prince William had made a future-defining announcement. Camilla's role in the next phase of monarchy would not be what some had assumed. The future queenly center of royal life was being firmly and unmistakably reserved elsewhere. The significance of that message was impossible to miss. Even people who knew almost nothing about constitutional nuance understood the emotional core at once. William was drawing the boundaries of the coming reign, while the present one was still alive. Britain was stunned. Newspapers rushed out new editions and sharpened online headlines within minutes. Commentators began using words like seismic, brutal, overdue, and inevitable. Outside palace gates, people gathered not because a death or abdication had occurred, but because they sensed a quieter kind of turning point. A monarchy reveals itself not only in great tragedies, but in moments when private hierarchy becomes visible enough for the public to feel that history is shifting beneath familiar faces. Some defended William immediately. They argued that he was doing what a responsible heir must do, protecting the coherence of the next reign, preventing confusion, and ensuring that Catherine's future role would be unquestioned from the beginning. Others recoiled at the coldness of it. They saw a woman late in life, publicly dutiful for years, being prepared for a dignified narrowing of influence by the very son of the man she had married. Still others saw something more tragic than either defense or criticism. They saw a family once again being asked by monarchy to choose between emotional loyalty and institutional clarity. That mattered because the conflict was never really about whether Camilla should vanish. It was about whether the future crown could tolerate two emotional legacies occupying the same symbolic space. William's answer was no. He believed the next reign had to begin without blurred lines, without inherited compromises, without the soft confusion that develops when an arrangement suited to one sovereign is quietly presumed to belong to the next. This was not about public affection. It was about royal geometry, about where power appears to sit, about what the nation sees when it looks at the people who stand closest to the throne. At the center of this was Catherine, though she remained outwardly almost silent. Her silence mattered precisely because it was not emptiness. It was poise, the kind of poise that tells the institution, without any statement at all, that the future already knows where its axis lies. She did not need to speak against Camilla. She did not need to speak for herself. William's announcement had already done both things at once, though with far more precision than any emotional outburst could have achieved. Catherine represented continuity without controversy, and William was determined that continuity would not be compromised by old accommodations carried too far into the future. There were reports of another smaller but equally revealing internal meeting, this time involving several of the king's most trusted private staff, a senior ceremonial advisor, and figures linked to both the current and future households. The purpose was not to debate William's announcement. That debate was over. The purpose was to interpret it operationally. Operationally is a dry word for a painful process. It meant turning a deeply human conflict into calendars, briefing notes, representational categories, and protocols. Which events would still naturally include Camilla in a central role under Charles? Which events tied to national continuity should now foreground William and Catherine more explicitly? Which communications required rebalancing? Which informal assumptions needed to end immediately? No one raised their voice, but the consequences widened. For Camilla, this was perhaps the hardest part of all. A single confrontation can wound, but it also passes. An operational dismantling is slower. It arrives in stages, a seat changed here, a role redefined there. An expectation gently lowered, a path once open now politely closed. It is the royal version of being told, over and over again, that you still matter, but not in the way you once believed. And because Camilla had spent so many years enduring public hostility, there was an almost unbearable irony in this new pain. She had survived the outer storm only to be limited by the inner one. Some close to the household began wondering whether a public show of unity might calm the situation. There was talk of appearances, of carefully staged images, of the old royal remedy for inner fracture, visual solidarity. But visual solidarity cannot erase structural truth once it has been set in motion. At best, it can soften the country's interpretation. At worst, it only sharpens the contrast between what was shown and what is known. William understood that. So did Charles. The family might still stand together. They almost certainly would. But they would stand together differently now, and everyone inside the institution would feel the difference, even if the crowd could only sense it. Princess Anne was also said to have weighed in privately. Anne has long carried the authority of someone whose loyalty to duty is beyond question. She is not sentimental about monarchy, which is why her views carry such force when the palace is under strain. Her position, according to those who later described it, was severe but clear. The institution could not be expected to preserve every emotional compromise made by one reign if preserving those compromises would complicate the next. In other words, the future had to be protected, even at personal cost. It was not a warm judgment, it was a royal one. Charles, trapped between the people he loved and the system he served, began to look visibly wearier in the days that followed. To the public, perhaps, it was just another tired royal face in a difficult season. To those who understood the deeper conflict, it was the face of a king who could not fully defend his wife without weakening his heir, and could not fully support his heir without wounding his wife. The monarchy often presents itself as an unbreakable line of continuity. But continuity is built from human beings, and human beings carry grief into every constitutional choice they make. The public statement, when it finally came, was carefully restrained. It spoke of long-term planning, evolving responsibilities, and the continued dignity of all senior members of the royal family. It denied drama without denying change. It was classic palace language, yet everyone understood what had happened. A state communication was more than a press release. It was the controlled voice of the institution, designed to calm markets of emotion without always telling the whole truth. The whole truth remained in the silences around the statement, in what it did not say about Camilla's future prominence, in what it implied about William's authority to shape the coming era, in what it revealed, without ever confessing it openly, about the monarchy's decision to choose preparation over comfort. The national debate deepened. Television hosts asked whether William had shown strength or cruelty. Newspaper columnists divided almost exactly along emotional lines. Some argued that monarchy requires the hard discipline of boundaries, and that William had simply done what Charles had lacked the will to do. Others said that whatever the institutional logic, the handling of Camilla exposed a colder and more calculating future king than many had imagined. But perhaps the sharpest observers understood that both readings could contain truth. The future monarch may sometimes appear cold, precisely because he is trying to prevent the institution from becoming emotionally incoherent. As the days passed, one final public event brought everything into focus. It had been scheduled well before the crisis became visible, which made it all the more revealing. Charles and William arrived together, their timing deliberate, their expressions composed, their body language almost too perfect in its restraint. They looked united, and in one sense they were. The conflict had not destroyed the family, but it had marked it. A few measured steps away, neither pushed out nor theatrically highlighted, Camilla took her place with visible dignity. Catherine stood in a position that seemed effortless and inevitable at once. No announcement was made there. None was needed. The image said everything. This was not exile. It was definition. That distinction mattered because exile can inspire rebellion. Definition demands adjustment. William had not tried to erase Camilla from royal life. He had done something more lasting. He had assigned her future limits. He had signaled to the institution, to the staff, to the advisors, to the media, and to the country that the next reign would not treat her current prominence as transferable inheritance. Her place belonged to Charles's chapter, not William's. There was pain in that. There was also clarity. And clarity, once visible, cannot easily be taken back. For a brief moment during that appearance, as cameras flashed and the crowd strained for a better look, Charles is said to have glanced toward both Camilla and William in almost the same movement. It was only a glance, but those who watched closely saw in it the entire burden of this story. The husband, the father, the king, 3 roles, all asking different things of the same man. Beside him stood the son who had forced the future into the present. Nearby stood the woman whose future had just been narrowed by that decision. And beside that future itself stood Catherine, calm, composed, carrying none of the visible strain but all of the symbolic consequence. There are moments in royal history when the loudest changes arrive, without scandal, without confession, without even a fully honest statement. They arrive through spacing, through timing, through the language of planning, through the repositioning of human beings within the frame of continuity. This was one of those moments. Britain had expected a routine palace message. Instead, it received a glimpse of the next monarchy defining itself in real time. Prince William's bombshell announcement about Camilla's future stunned Britain because it was more than a family decision. It was a declaration about the shape of royal power, the limits of marital influence, and the emotional terms under which one reign yields to another. It was a reminder that the monarchy survives not by avoiding pain, but by organizing it, by taking private heartbreak and turning it into public order, by insisting that even love must sometimes accept a boundary when the crown is involved. In the end, no one left this untouched. Camilla remained
Why his
beside
silence
the king,
mattered.
but with a
If he
future no
defended
longer
Camilla,
open to quiet
he risked
expansion.
weakening William.
Charles remained
If
sovereign,
he defended
but more
William,
exposed than
he
ever,
wounded her.
as a man divided
Catherine
between
had seen the
personal
pain
devotion
before the
and
room
dynastic
ever heard the
necessity.
words.
William
Before the
emerged
briefing,
unmistakably
she
as
watched
a
William
future
remove
monarch
every
prepared to
emotional
choose
phrase from the
structure over
statement,
sentiment if he
leaving
believes
only
the
cold
institution
certainty.
requires it.
The Princess of
Catherine
Wales
emerged without needing a single dramatic line as the uncontested emotional and symbolic center of the era to come. And perhaps that is why this story feels so powerful. It is not simply about Camilla
next
losing
reign could not
something,
begin with
or
old
William
conflicts
asserting
still
something,
holding the
or
door.
Charles suffering
William had
something.
entered that
It is
rehearsal
about the
expecting
monarchy
order,
choosing
not
a shape,
resistance.
choosing the
Windsor
future
Castle
before the
mattered
present has fully
because it was
finished.
not just another
Choosing
royal
clarity
home.
even when
It was a
clarity
working
hurts.
symbol
The
of
family
family
remained
history,
wounded, but
authority,
united enough to
and
continue.
continuity.
The future
The
was
succession
acknowledged
rehearsal
without
was meant to
formally
settle
ending the
private
present.
details before the
Love and
country
duty
ever
could
saw
no
them.
longer remain in the
Succession,
same form,
in plain
and
words,
so the palace
means
did
the
what
planned
palaces
passing
have
of
always
royal
done in their darkest and most disciplined moments. It turned pain into protocol and called it continuity. The cameras moved on. The official words softened the edges. The gates remained guarded. The portraits still hung in silence. But inside the royal household, everyone understood that something had shifted forever. Not with a scream, not with a scandal, but with a measured royal announcement that redrew Camilla's future and, in doing so, quietly announced the emotional terms of the monarchy yet to come. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.